Jonathan Carter drove silently across the Texas desert, enjoying the vastness of the landscape around him. The sun was already beginning to sink below the horizon, tinting the sky with orange and purple, while the engine of his car purred softly on the empty road. After spending a few days in El Paso visiting his sister, he was heading home, savoring that moment of solitude and freedom. At 65 years old, he had already lived more than most men, and his career as a former FBI director gave him a unique perspective on the world, a vision shaped by decades of work fighting crime and corruption. But that night, alone on the road, he was neither a powerful man nor an imposing government figure. He was just an ordinary driver, crossing a deserted highway, not imagining that in a few minutes he would be fighting for his life. It was then that he saw red and blue flashing lights in his rearview mirror. No siren, just the silent, menacing glow reflected on the dark asphalt. Jonathan frowned. He knew the protocols for police stops well. He knew something that was out of the ordinary. He quickly checked the dashboard indicators. Speed under control, enough fuel, nothing that would justify a stop. His car was impeccable, the documentation in order. Even so, he slowed down and pulled over onto the shoulder, feeling a familiar weight tighten his chest. Keeping calm, he turned off the engine and placed his hands on the steering wheel. His fingers spread wide. It was an automatic gesture, a reflex honed over a lifetime. There, at that moment, he was not a former FBI director. He was just a black man, standing on the road, waiting for the inevitable. The steps on the gravel came slowly, but laden with a hostile weight. Jonathan felt cold sweat forming at the nape of his neck, even before he saw the officer's face in the rearview mirror. The man approached with an exaggeratedly rigid posture, as if he were about to confront a threat. The badge on his chest read, V. Hensley, and the look he cast at Jonathan did not hide his contempt. Without a word, he stood there for a moment, scrutinizing him as though evaluating something he had already decided he did not like. Then finally, he broke the silence. Driver's license and vehicle registration. Now, boy. The word was loaded, dripping with venom. Jonathan maintained controlled breathing, his face impassive, as he had learned to do countless times before. Without arguing or questioning, he slowly retrieved his documents and handed them over. Hensley took the papers with indifference, pretending to examine them while his other hand rested on the holster of his gun. Jonathan knew exactly what was happening. It wasn't about safety, nor about any potential infraction. It was about dominance. The power dynamic was clear, and the officer wanted him to know who was in charge. Before Jonathan could even retrieve his documents, another patrol car stopped behind them. Looking in his mirror, Jonathan saw a second officer stepping out of the vehicle, a man older, with broad shoulders and calculating eyes. Pete Rollins, he read on the metallic insignia pinned to his chest. This one hadn't come to ease the situation. He had come to reinforce it. In the days following the incident in the cafeteria, Connor didn't slow down. In fact, he seemed more determined than ever to destroy Eva. Realizing that she wouldn't succumb to the game of direct provocation, he changed his strategy. What had once been physical attacks and public humiliations became insidious. He began to spread small lies, dropping them like bait in the hallways, in whispered conversations, on the school's social media. First, he insinuated that Eva had an aggressive temperament, that she was one of those who explode over anything. Then, he distorted stories, turning minor casual interactions into alleged fights where he, the poor, innocent Connor, had been threatened by her. Rumors spread like poison, each one more absurd than the previous. The final blow came one afternoon when an image began circulating on the student's Instagram. The photo showed Eva in the school parking lot, apparently with a disturbed expression, staring at Connor. The problem? The photo had been edited. Someone had tampered with the saturation, darkened the shadows, and accentuated every line of tension on her face. The caption read, "Psycho Sinclair can't control herself. That was all it took for the entire school to have an excuse to turn against her. In the hallways, suspicious glances followed her. Some people laughed, others whispered, and worst of all, no one, absolutely no one, said anything in her defense. Eva was no longer just a girl subject to ridicule. She was now someone to be avoided. Jonathan remained still, watching Rollins approach with a half-smile on his face. Not a friendly smile, but the kind of expression that announced something terrible was about to happen. The second officer stopped beside Hensley, crossed his arms, and tilted his head slightly. "Is something wrong there, partner?" he asked, without taking his eyes off Jonathan. Hensley laughed shortly, as if he had been waiting for that cue. "I'm still deciding," he replied, as he folded the documents disdainfully and stuffed them into his pocket. Jonathan felt the tension in the air thicken like a storm about to break. He didn't need to hear the next words to know how it would end. Still, he tried to maintain control of the situation. "My documents are in order, officers. If there is any problem, let me know so I can resolve it," he said, his voice firm yet not aggressive. But the two men weren't there to resolve anything. Rollins stepped forward, now close enough for Jonathan to smell the tobacco and sweat on his uniform. "Get out of the car, boy." This time the word was even more loaded, accompanied by a look that exuded the certainty of impunity. Jonathan knew arguing was useless. He got out of the car calmly, keeping his hands visible. He had faced high-level criminals, terrorists, and corrupt politicians before, but nothing had prepared him for this kind of violence that needed no reason, only an excuse. The hot desert wind blew against his face as his feet touched the asphalt. Hensley was already by his side, too close, invading his space. "Is there something in the car that I should know about?" The question was rhetorical. Jonathan didn't have time to answer before he felt the first blow. The impact of the baton on the right side of his head was sharp, ripping his skin and momentarily numbing his vision. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth before he could recover. There was no time to react. The second blow struck his ribs, forcing the air from his lungs. The ground seemed to spin, but he did not fall. Not yet. He was familiar with that pain. He had been hit before, but never like this. This wasn't a fight. It was a silent execution. Jonathan tried to stay on his feet, but his legs faltered under the weight of the blows. His instinct urged him to react, to defend himself, but he knew that any sudden movement would give Hensley and Rollins the perfect excuse to claim resistance. Not that they needed one. The third blow came before he could catch his breath, hitting his jaw hard enough to make him see white flashes. He felt the taste of blood intensify, a warm trickle running down his chin. The rough asphalt of the Texas desert seemed distant, as if he were suspended between pain and indignation. He had seen this before, in videos, in reports, in the faces of men who never stood a chance. But now it was his turn. He was the face, the target. Rollins's hands grabbed his shoulders and threw him against the hood of his own car, the hot metal burning through his sweaty shirt. "Resisting arrest, huh? What a surprise," Hensley mocked as he pulled the handcuffs from his belt. The clatter of metal echoed in the silent night before Jonathan's wrists were brutally yanked backwards. The pain spread through his joints, but he said nothing. He wouldn't give them the pleasure of even a groan. Rollins's knee dug into his spine, pinning him against the car. Jonathan tried to control his breathing, but his chest ached with every inhalation. He already knew what was coming next. The false accusation, the flimsy pretext to justify the brutality. He could already hear the next steps in his mind. Drugs, found by chance in the glove compartment, an official report stating that he moved suspiciously. Any convenient excuse to justify the abuse. But Jonathan was no ordinary man. And contrary to what those officers thought, he wasn't alone. The world around him spun in shades of red and black. Jonathan blinked hard, trying to dispel the dizziness caused by the blows, as he felt the cold metal of the handcuffs cut into his skin. But even with the throbbing pain in his head and the blood streaming down his face, his mind remained sharp. He knew he couldn't afford to lose consciousness. Hensley and Rollins believed they controlled the situation, but there was something they didn't know. Subtly moving his fingers, Jonathan pressed on the inner seam of his jacket, where a small button was hidden. The movement was almost imperceptible, but it was enough. The signal was sent, a single silent transmission that activated a protocol known to few. He had always known that one day he might need it. The FBI trained its agents for countless situations, but nothing in the world had prepared a black man to be at the mercy of corrupt police in the middle of the desert. Hensley continued talking, laughing through gritted teeth, completely oblivious to what was about to happen. "You think anyone will care about an old retiree like you? No one cares." Rollins had already stepped away a bit, rummaging through something inside Jonathan's car, probably looking for a good spot to find some compromising evidence. It was then that a sound came, a deep, distant, but unmistakable noise. Helicopters. Jonathan couldn't help but smile, a small, discreet, yet genuine smile. The gleam in Hensley's eyes faltered for a second. Then the headlights appeared. SUVs emerged from the darkness like predators, advancing along the road at an alarming speed. The sound of tires burning on the asphalt resounded loudly, followed by the clamor of doors opening and firm voices cutting through the air. "FBI, hands where I can see them." The tables had turned, and Jonathan knew that, this time, he wasn't the only one to witness justice being done. Panic filled Hensley and Rollins's eyes before their minds could even process the situation. The intense light from the helicopter spotlights turned the road into broad daylight, revealing every detail of the scene. Jonathan, handcuffed and bloodied, the two officers still clutching their weapons, now useless against the force rising against them. The doors of the FBI SUVs swung open simultaneously, and heavily armed agents emerged in formation, their voices slicing through the air with precise commands. "Hands up! Get on the ground now!" Rollins was the first to react, dropping the flashlight he held and slowly raising his hands, as if trying to pretend he had nothing to do with the situation. Hensley hesitated a second longer, which proved to be a mistake. An agent swiftly approached, twisting his arm behind him and throwing him face first onto the asphalt. The cry of pain that escaped his mouth was muffled by the force of a knee pressing between his shoulder blades. Jonathan, still leaning against the hood of his car, finally let out a long sigh. The operations chief, a tall man in a dark suit, walked toward him while another agent removed the handcuffs from his wrists. "Director Carter," he said, with a respect that stood in brutal contrast to the treatment Jonathan had received just minutes before. Hensley and Rollins, now handcuffed and sitting on the ground like common criminals, froze upon hearing the name. The look of horror on their faces was almost comical. Almost. They hadn't beaten up just anyone. They had beaten up a former FBI director, a man who knew the inner workings of the system better than anyone. Jonathan slowly rotated his wrists, massaging the skin marked by the metal. He looked at the fallen officers, his eyes heavy with something that wasn't anger or vengeance, but a deep fatigue. "Now you understand," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Yet he knew the truth. Hensley and Rollins would never understand. Not then, not later. For men like them, nothing was more intolerable than defeat, except humiliation. While Hensley and Rollins were dragged into the FBI vehicles, Jonathan remained in the middle of the road, feeling the hot desert dust settling around him. The relief that should have accompanied the arrest of his aggressors never came. Something inside him whispered that this was only the beginning, and he was right. One of the agents approached, holding a tablet with its screen illuminated. "Director, we found something," the agent said, handing the device to Jonathan. With eyes still burning from the dried blood, he focused on what lay before him. They were internal files from the local police, messages exchanged between officers, records of forged stops, complaints filed before they even reached the Justice Department. Hensley and Rollins weren't just two corrupt officers. They were part of a much larger network, something organized and systematic. And the name that appeared most frequently in the documents was one Jonathan knew well: Clyde Warren. Reading the documents was enough to confirm what Jonathan had already suspected. This wasn't the work of two men acting on their own. It was an entire system operating in the shadows of the law, a structure of corruption that kept criminals protected and honest officers intimidated. And Clyde Warren was the architect of it all. Officially, he was merely a retired ex-cop, but everyone in the FBI knew that he had never truly relinquished control of the police force in El Paso. For years, it had been suspected that he manipulated investigations, protected high-level criminals, and maintained a network of bribes that reached from street officers to the courts. The problem had always been proving it. Now, however, Jonathan had something concrete. The silence of the night no longer seemed as tranquil as before. He knew what had to be done, but he also knew that by crossing that line, he would be declaring war against an enemy that played dirty. And Warren was not the kind to lose without a fight. Jonathan knew that exposing that corruption network would not be met with silence. Men like Clyde Warren didn't just accumulate power, they protected it with tooth and nail. And the response came faster than he expected. The next morning, still recovering from the previous night's injuries, Jonathan received a phone call from an unknown number. He answered, keeping his voice firm, but the silence on the other end lasted only a few seconds before a dry warning was whispered. "You should already know that this doesn't end well for those who poke around where they shouldn't." The call disconnected before he could respond. Jonathan didn't need much to understand the message. Warren was already on the move, and it wasn't long before the threat materialized. In the early hours of the next morning, Jonathan awoke to the thunderous sound of his front door being forced open. He leapt out of bed instinctively, reaching for the drawer where he kept an emergency weapon. But before he could even react, he heard his wife Lena's voice shouting from the hallway. Corrupt or not, the men invading his house were wearing police uniforms. They rummaged through drawers, overturned closets, until one of them let out a cry of feigned surprise. "Look what we have here," he said, holding up 2 packets of cocaine that clearly did not belong in that place. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a mix of fury and weariness. He already knew exactly what was happening. They were planting evidence. Within minutes, he was handcuffed and taken outside as neighbors watched the scene with confused expressions. But what hurt him most was not the public humiliation. It was the look on Jamal's face, his 12-year-old son, standing at the top of the stairs, watching his father being taken away like a criminal. A look that Jonathan would never forget. The cell was small, cold, and reeked of sweat and cheap disinfectant that had seeped into the walls. Jonathan had been in many police stations throughout his life, but always on the other side of the bars. Now, sitting on a hard concrete bench, he observed the officers around him, most of them pretending not to recognize him. Yet he could see in their eyes, some knew exactly who he was, and they knew they were making a mistake. Still, no one spoke up. Warren didn't need loyal soldiers, just men willing to remain silent. The sergeant in charge of the unit approached the cell and stared at him for a moment before speaking. "We have a warrant signed by a judge. Possession and drug trafficking, Carter. There's no way out for you." Jonathan maintained a neutral expression. He had dealt with criminals who lied better than that man. But what the officers didn't know was that Jonathan had already anticipated this. He had activated his second emergency device at the exact moment the men invaded his house. It was a simple yet efficient protocol. In less than an hour, news of his arrest reached the FBI, and they came. The police station door was flung open with a crash, and the sound of firm footsteps echoed down the corridor. The agent in charge of the case, Andrew Hayes, stormed in, holding a thick envelope in his hands. "Release him now!" His voice reverberated through the room. The sergeant hesitated, trying to maintain his composure, but he knew he was defeated. Hayes tossed the documents onto the registration desk. They were irrefutable evidence that the drug packets had been planted by the very officers who arrested him. Jonathan felt the handcuffs being removed, but his mind was already elsewhere. He was no longer just Warren's target. Now, he was his declared enemy. Jonathan left the police station without uttering a word, but inside, something had changed. He was no longer merely a man defending himself. Now, he was a hunter. Warren had made a grave mistake. He'd attacked a man who knew how to dismantle criminal networks better than anyone. On the way to the FBI headquarters, Jonathan scarcely blinked, his mind already formulating a plan. Arresting Warren wasn't enough. He knew that as long as there were people in the system protecting him, Warren would find a way to escape. Something bigger was needed, something definitive. As soon as he arrived at headquarters, he went straight to the meeting room where a team of analysts and investigators awaited him. He wasted no time. "I want everything on Warren. Bank accounts, phone calls, assets, suspicious transactions. If he's been anywhere near someone who might be our link, I want to know." His voice was firm and cutting. He wasn't asking, he was commanding. The first reports began to arrive rapidly. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, suspicious deposits of large sums of money, transfers passing through shell companies. But what really caught attention was the network of contacts, judges, prosecutors, police chiefs, all somehow linked to Warren. It was an underground empire sustained by fear and corruption, but empires fall when their foundations are exposed to the light. Jonathan knew that time was crucial. Warren must already be preparing to strike back. That's why he decided not to wait. He strategically released the first pieces of evidence to the media, small leaks, enough for journalists and reporters to begin sniffing out the story. It was a double blow. On one hand, public pressure mounted. On the other, Warren's allies began to feel that the ship was sinking. And when criminals realize that their leader might fall, the instinct for survival speaks louder. They begin to betray. The first to fall were the small pawns on the board. Low-level officers began to be arrested, their homes and offices searched, and each new search revealed more evidence of Warren's criminal web. Signed documents, money transfers, messages exchanged on seized cell phones. The kind of evidence that left no room for excuses. The FBI knew that these men, on their own, weren't the real threat. But they were the key. Faced with the promise of a reduced sentence, many began to talk, and when one started, the others followed. Soon, the names of judges, prosecutors, and businessmen began to emerge during interrogations. One by one, the pillars that upheld Warren began to crumble. Jonathan watched everything closely, remaining cold and calculating. He knew that Warren still had tricks up his sleeve, but now the net was tightening. There was no way out. The final blow came with a federal warrant. In the late afternoon, a coordinated operation surrounded Clyde Warren's mansion. Helicopters hovered over the property, armed agents seized the entrance gates, and the media gathered outside, broadcasting everything live. There were no secret exits, no allies willing to sacrifice themselves for him. Warren tried to maintain his composure, wearing a forced smile as agents handcuffed him. But Jonathan saw in his eyes, for the first time, fear. His arrogance had dissipated, replaced by the harsh reality that his era of untouchability was over. As he was led to the police car, journalists shouted questions. Warren did not answer because deep down he knew. What Jonathan Carter had started, Warren could not stop. Even with Warren behind bars and his criminal network crumbling, Jonathan knew that it didn't mean the battle was over. The FBI continued dismantling the remnants of the scheme, but Jonathan understood that corrupt systems do not vanish overnight. There were still judges who could try to overturn sentences, prosecutors who might manipulate processes, and officers who would continue to protect themselves. But for now, the main structure was destroyed. The impact of the arrests was immediate. Protests erupted in El Paso, with citizens demanding a complete reform of the local police. The media treated Jonathan as a symbol of resistance and justice, yet he refused any heroic label. To him, it wasn't a personal victory, it was a moral obligation. Still, there was something that hurt him more than any headline: his family. When he returned home for the first time since his arrest, he found Lena sitting on the couch, staring fixedly at the turned-off television. Jamal was in his room, refusing to come out. Jonathan sat beside his wife and took her hand, but she did not reciprocate immediately. "I thought I was going to lose you," she finally said in a low voice, laden with a fear she didn't want to show. Jonathan had no answer for that. He could defeat criminals and dismantle corruption networks, but he didn't know how to erase the fear that now lived in their home. When he finally climbed the stairs and opened Jamal's bedroom door, he found his son lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The boy didn't even look at him. "They could have killed you, Dad," he whispered, almost as if speaking to himself. Jonathan sat at the edge of the bed, unsure of how to respond, because deep down, he knew Jamal was right. Jonathan remained there, sitting in his son's room, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. He had spent his entire life fighting for justice, but at that moment he realized that the scars of this war were not just physical. They were etched in his family, in Lena's gaze, in the trembling voice of Jamal. He might spend years dismantling corruption networks and taking down men like Warren, but there would always be others, always someone willing to manipulate the system. He wondered if it was worth it, if all that fighting would ever bring anything other than more pain. But then he looked at Jamal and knew the answer. It wasn't about changing the entire world. It was about ensuring that his son grew up knowing that some battles, even the hardest ones, must be fought. The next morning, Jonathan left home before sunrise. He walked to the porch and inhaled deeply the cold pre-dawn air. His body still ached, his wounds still there, but his mind was clearer than ever. He knew that the war against injustice would never have a definitive end, but that didn't mean it should be abandoned. He looked at the horizon and decided that he would move forward, not as a legend, not as a symbol of justice, but as a man who simply refused to let wrong prevail. He turned back into the house, where Lena was making coffee and Jamal was descending the stairs, still hesitant, but looking at him in a different way, not with fear, with respect. And in that moment, Jonathan knew that, regardless of what the future held, he had already won the most important battle of all.